Hello everyone, welcome to the Mysterious Stories channel, where you'll discover the most mysterious, scary, and fascinating stories. Make sure to turn up the volume and get ready for a spine-chilling experience you won't forget. The names and places in this story are fictional, but the events, my grandfather swore, were real. It was during the Vietnam War, a time when the living and the dead walked close to each other in the deep jungles and dark nights. This is one of those encounters that still chills my blood to this day. It was July 1969, just before the monsoon season, when Sergeant Richard Rick Davis and his squad were assigned a new mission. The U.S. military had received reports of suspicious enemy activity near a remote valley deep in the bamboo forest, a place known to the locals as the Valley of Shadows. The mission was simple: recon, locate, and call in airstrikes if necessary. The team of 12 men, including his best friend, Private Tom Nelson, was briefed in a dusty outpost near the Vietnamese border. The air was thick with humidity and the scent of burning wood from nearby villages. Their commanding officer, Captain Harris, handed Rick a tattered map, his face grim as he pointed out the valley. "It's been quiet for weeks, too quiet. I want eyes on the ground, Davis, and whatever you do, keep your men sharp. The locals have ... stories about this place." Rick nodded, brushing off the captain's warning. They'd heard ghost stories from villagers before, tales of restless spirits, haunted woods, and cursed valleys. But war was war, and Rick had seen enough death and bloodshed to know that the living were more dangerous than the dead. At least, that's what he believed at the time. The squad set off early the next morning, moving deeper into the dense bamboo forest. The forest was unlike anything they had ever encountered: thick, dark, and seemingly impenetrable. The further they went, the narrower the path became, and the more oppressive the atmosphere grew. The thick bamboo creaked and swayed in the wind, though there was no wind. It was as if the forest was alive, watching them, waiting. By midday, they reached the outskirts of the valley. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the ground. The valley itself was eerily quiet: no birds, no insects, just the rustle of leaves and the soft whisper of the wind through the bamboo. "This place gives me the creeps, Rick," Tom muttered, glancing around uneasily. The others felt it to a sense of unease that settled into their bones, like the air was too thick to breathe. Rick ordered the men to set up camp for the night. They planned to scout the valley at dawn, then move through the forest and confirm any enemy presence. As they ate their rations around the fire, the men talked quietly, keeping their voices low. Though no one could say why, it was as if the darkness itself had ears. That night, the first strange thing happened. Around midnight, Private Dawson, who was on watch, heard something moving through the tree's soft footsteps, just beyond the circle of light cast by the fire. At first, he thought it was an animal, maybe a deer or a boar, but then the footsteps stopped, and a low, haunting whistle echoed through the forest. He woke Rick and the others, whispering what he'd heard. They listened in tense silence, but the forest was deathly still. No more footsteps, no whistle. Rick brushed it off as nerves and told Dawson to stay alert, but the unease grew among the squad. The next day, they moved into the valley, pushing deeper into the forest. The trees grew taller, the bamboo thicker, and the light dimmer as they moved through the narrow paths. Strange markings began to appear on the trees: deep scratches that looked like claw marks, and odd, twisting symbols that none of them could decipher. "Probably just the locals messing with us," Rick muttered under his breath, though he didn't believe it. As they approached the center of the valley, the forest opened up into a small clearing, and there, in the middle of the clearing, stood a crumbling pagoda, ancient and covered in moss. The air around it was cold, colder than it should have been in the sweltering jungle. And as they stepped closer, the forest grew silent again: no birds, no wind, just a deep, suffocating quiet. "Spread out, search the area," Rick ordered, but even he felt the weight of something wrong in that place. The men searched the clearing, finding no signs of enemy activity. But as Private Nelson approached the pagoda, something strange happened. The air seemed to ripple, and a figure appeared in the doorway, a woman, pale and dressed in traditional Vietnamese clothing, her long black hair covering her face. "Rick, you seeing this?" Tom whispered, his voice shaking. Rick turned and saw her too. The woman stood there, unmoving, staring at them with unseeing eyes. Without warning, she began to walk toward them, her movements slow and deliberate, her feet not quite touching the ground. "Fall back," Rick shouted, but the woman kept coming. And as she did, the forest around them seemed to close in, the bamboo creaking and groaning like the bones of the dead. The men scrambled back, their weapons drawn, but when they turned to look, the woman was gone. That night, they huddled together around the fire, too terrified to speak of what they had seen. But as the hours passed, strange things began to happen. The fire flickered and dimmed, and whispers filled the air, soft, distant voices that seemed to be coming from the trees. The ground beneath them seemed to shift, like something was moving beneath the earth. And then, in the dead of night, they heard it again, that same low whistle from the night before, closer this time, and followed by the soft sound of footsteps, circling their camp. The sun barely rose the next morning, casting only a pale, sickly light through the thick canopy of the bamboo forest. Rick and his men were exhausted, having spent the night listening to those eerie whispers, the footsteps that circled their camp but never approached. Each of them had seen shadows moving in the trees, but no one spoke about it. The fear was palpable, and it hung in the air like the thick humidity. Private Tom Nelson, Rick's best friend, hadn't said a word since the ghostly woman had vanished before their eyes. His face was pale, eyes darting nervously toward the pagoda that loomed in the distance. Rick had seen Tom face artillery fire and ambushes without flinching, but this was different. They were in enemy territory, yet it felt like they were being hunted by something much worse than the Viet Cong. "Rick, what was that thing?" Tom finally muttered as they packed up their gear. His voice was low, trembling slightly. "I don't know," Rick replied, though he tried to keep his voice steady. "But we need to keep moving. If there's any enemy out here, we have to find them and complete the mission." The squad fell into a tense silence as they began their march deeper into the valley. The trees closed in around them, the path barely visible through the dense foliage. The deeper they went, the more the landscape seemed to twist and distort. The ground became uneven, as if the earth itself was shifting beneath their feet. The oppressive atmosphere grew heavier, the air thick with the scent of decay and something else, something metallic, like blood. They reached the first waypoint, a ridge overlooking the valley below. Rick ordered the men to set up a defensive position and scan the area for enemy activity. But there was nothing, no movement, no signs of life. Just the endless expanse of bamboo stretching out below them. "Nothing on the scope," Private Dawson reported, his voice uneasy. "It's like this place is dead." "Keep your eyes open," Rick replied, though he felt the same creeping dread in his gut. It was too quiet. As they rested for a moment, Rick couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. He scanned the tree line, his hand instinctively gripping his rifle tighter. The forest felt alive in a way that had nothing to do with the jungle's natural vibrancy. There was something lurking in the shadows, something that seemed to shift and flicker, just out of sight. And then they saw it. From the ridge, Rick spotted movement in the distance, just beyond the second waypoint, a village, hidden among the thick trees. It was small, the huts crumbling and overgrown with vines, as if abandoned for decades. There were no signs of life, but the sight of it sent a chill down his spine. "We head there next," Rick said, pointing toward the village. The men exchanged uneasy glances, but no one protested. Orders were orders, and they had to see this mission through. As they descended into the valley, the bamboo forest seemed to close in tighter around them. The air grew colder, the shadows darker. The village loomed ahead like a ghost town, silent and still, except for the soft rustling of leaves in the wind that didn't seem to touch the ground. When they entered the village, It was clear that it had been abandoned for a long time. The huts were in various states of collapse, and the air was thick with the smell of damp wood and mold. But there was something else, a faint, metallic scent that none of them could place. "Spread out," Rick ordered, though his own nerves were frayed. "Look for anything that doesn't belong." The men moved cautiously, rifles raised, scanning every corner of the crumbling village. But as they moved deeper into the village, they began to notice strange things. The walls of the huts were scratched and marked with symbols similar to the ones they had seen in the forest, twisting, claw-like marks that made no sense. And then there were the bones, small, scattered remains of animals, and something else, too large to be an animal. "This place gives me the creeps," Private Williams muttered, his eyes wide as he scanned the surroundings. "Feels like we're being watched." Rick felt it too, that oppressive weight, the sensation of eyes boring into the back of his skull. The forest had gone silent again. No birds, no wind. Just the suffocating quiet and the sense of something lurking in the shadows. And then the whispers started again. Low, distant at first, like the whine through the trees. But as the men moved deeper into the village, the whispers grew louder, more distinct. Words in a language none of them understood, soft and insistent, like voices calling out from the darkness. "Rick, we need to get out of here," Tom whispered, his face pale and eyes wide with fear. "Something's wrong with this place." Rick nodded, the hair on the back of his neck standing on end. "Regroup at the edge of the village. We need to move." But as they began to pull back, something changed. The air grew colder, and the shadows seemed to deepen around them. And then, out of the corner of Rick's eye, he saw movement. A figure tall, gaunt, and impossibly fast darting between the trees. "Contact," Dawson shouted, raising his rifle. But when they turned to look, there was nothing there, just the swaying bamboo and the eerie silence. And then they heard it, the low, haunting whistle that had followed them the night before, echoing through the village. The men froze, fear tightening their chests as the whistle grew louder, closer. Out of the shadows, a figure stepped forward, a man, or at least what had once been a man, dressed in tattered, rotting military fatigues. His face was gaunt, eyes sunken deep into his skull, and his skin hung loosely from his bones, as if he had been dead for years. Rick's heart pounded in his chest as the figure raised a bony finger and pointed directly at them. The whispering voices grew louder, almost deafening now, and the air around them seemed to hum with unnatural energy. "Fall back," Rick shouted, his voice barely cutting through the cacophony of whispers and that eerie whistle. The men scrambled to retreat, their nerves frayed and hands trembling as they pushed through the bamboo, away from the haunted village. But even as they ran, the forest seemed to close in around them, the whispers following, growing louder, more desperate, and the shadowy figures, more of them now, darted through the trees, watching, waiting. The patrol had become a nightmare, and Rick knew that, whatever they had stumbled into, it wasn't just a ghost story, it was real. As the squad stumbled out of the abandoned village, the eerie whispers finally faded, replaced by the low rustling of leaves in the wind. But the atmosphere remained oppressive, thick with the unshakable feeling that they were being watched. Rick's heart was still pounding. The image of that gaunt, ghostly figure burned into his mind. They gathered at the edge of the forest, catching their breath, but no one dared to speak. The fear was written on every face veil, drawn tight with unease. Rick's hand trembled slightly as he wiped the sweat from his brow, scanning the tree line for any sign of pursuit. Whatever had been haunting them in the village hadn't followed them, at least not openly. Private Dawson, always the skeptic, was the first to break the silence. "That thing back there, it couldn't have been real. Just some trick of the light, right?" His voice was shaky, betraying the confidence he tried to project. Tom Nelson, still pale from the previous night's encounter, shook his head. "I don't know. Man, I've seen a lot of things in this war, but nothing like that. It looked dead, but it was moving, like it wanted something from us." Rick nodded grimly. "We're not alone in this jungle. And I don't mean the Viet Cong. There's something here, something ancient. We need to keep moving. Get to the next waypoint. Stay sharp. They continued their patrol, pushing deeper into the dense bamboo forest. The underbrush seemed thicker now, the trees looming taller, as if the jungle itself was closing in around them. The sunlight, already dim through the thick canopy, faded even more, casting long, ghostly shadows on the ground. Every step felt heavier, the weight of unseen eyes pressing down on them. Rick led the way, his senses on high alert. The air was cooler now, the oppressive heat of the jungle replaced by an unnatural chill that seemed to seep into their bones. And then there was the smell, faint at first, but growing stronger as they moved forward. A metallic tang, like rust and decay, that made Rick's stomach turn. The whispers began again, just on the edge of hearing, low and indistinct. The men exchanged nervous glances, but kept moving, their rifles gripped tightly. It felt like they were being drawn deeper into the jungle, as if the forest itself was guiding them towards something they didn't want to find. After what felt like hours, they came upon a clearing. In the center of it stood a pagoda, much like the one they had seen the night before, but this one was different. It was larger, its stone walls covered in thick vines and strange, twisted symbols etched into the surface. The structure seemed ancient, as if it had been there long before the war had ever started. The squad stopped at the edge of the clearing, staring at the pagoda in uneasy silence. There was something wrong about it, something deeply unsettling. The air was colder here, and the metallic scent of blood was stronger, almost overwhelming. "What the hell is this place?" Williams muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. Rick didn't answer. His eyes were fixed on the pagoda, on the strange markings that seemed to pulse and shift in the dim light. He could feel something drawing him closer, an inexplicable pull that made his skin crawl. The whispers were louder now, more distinct. Voices speaking a language he couldn't understand, yet somehow felt disturbingly familiar. As they moved cautiously toward the structure, Rick's instinct screamed at him to turn back. But they had orders, and they couldn't return empty-handed. Whatever this place was, it had to be connected to the enemy, didn't it? Private Dawson took a step forward, his rifle raised. "I'll check it out," he said, though his voice lacked its usual bravado. "No," Rick snapped, grabbing his shoulder. "We stick together. We don't know what we're dealing with." The squad approached the pagoda as one, their nerves frayed, their senses on high alert. The door to the structure was partially open, the darkness inside impenetrable. The metallic smell was almost unbearable now, mixing with the scent of damp earth and decay. Rick swallowed hard, his heart hammering in his chest. "We go in, take a quick look, and get out. No one goes in alone. Stay close." They entered the pagoda, stepping into the thick shadows that swallowed them whole. The air inside was cold, much colder than outside, and the walls seemed to hum with a strange energy. The floor was littered with debris bones, old weapons, and rusted metal fragments, as if the place had once been the site of a long-forgotten battle. But it wasn't just the debris that made their skin crawl. It was the overwhelming sense of being watched, of something lurking just beyond the edge of their vision, waiting. "Jesus," Tom whispered, his voice trembling. "What is this place?" Rick didn't answer. His eyes were drawn to the far corner of the room, where something glinted in the dim light. As he approached, the object became clear, a metal box, old and covered in strange, twisted symbols, just like the ones outside. Instinctively, Rick reached for it, his hand trembling as his fingers brushed the cold surface of the box. The moment he touched it, the whispers rose to a deafening roar, and the room seemed to shift, the shadows twisting and closing in around them. "Rick, we need to go," Dawson said, his voice tense. "Now," but Rick couldn't move. His hand was glued to the box, and his mind was flooded with images terrifying. Nightmarish visions of death and destruction, of ancient rituals and sacrifices made in blood. He saw figures cloaked in shadow, their eyes burning with an unnatural light, watching as men were slaughtered in the name of something far older than the jungle itself. Suddenly, the box slipped from his grip, and the room went silent. The whispers faded, and the oppressive weight lifted just enough for Rick to pull back, gasping for air. He looked around at his men, their faces pale with fear, and knew that they had all felt it too. "We need to leave," Rick said, his voice hoarse. "We need to get out of here. Ow!" But as they turned to leave the pagoda, a low, guttural growl echoed from the darkness behind them. The shadows shifted, and something moved, a figure, tall and gaunt, with glowing red eyes that burned through the dark. The men froze, terror gripping their hearts as the creature stepped forward, its skeletal hand reaching out toward them. And then, with a bone-chilling screech, it lunged. The creature lunged from the shadows, its red eyes glowing with a sinister light, and the squad scattered in panic. Rick's heart pounded in his chest as he dove for cover behind a pile of broken stone. The screeching echoed through the small pagoda, chilling him to his core. His hands trembled as he gripped his rifle, unsure if it would do anything against whatever that thing was. Dawson fired wildly into the darkness, his bullets ricocheting off the stone walls. "What the hell, that thing?" he yelled, his voice high with terror. Rick peeked out from his cover just in time to see the creature vanish into the shadows, its twisted form moving unnaturally fast, leaving nothing but a gust of cold air in its wake. "We need to move," Rick shouted, pulling himself up and grabbing Tom Nelson by the arm. The rest of the squad was already on their feet, scrambling for the exit. The air inside the pagoda had become frigid, and the oppressive atmosphere only intensified as they rushed out into the open jungle once more. The clearing outside seemed different now, darker and more menacing. The trees loomed taller, their branches reaching down like skeletal hands. The whispers had returned, louder and more insistent, filling the air with an otherworldly hum. Rick could feel the weight of unseen eyes on him, watching their every move. Dawson cursed under his breath as he ran, glancing nervously over his shoulder. "We should have never come here. This place is cursed." Rick didn't respond. His mind was racing, trying to make sense of what had just happened. The creature they had seen, it wasn't human, and it wasn't Viet Cong. It was something older, something that didn't belong in the world of the living. They regrouped at the edge of the clearing, panting and shaking with fear. No one spoke for a long moment, the only sound being the rustling of the wind through the thick bamboo. Rick scanned the tree line, his grip tight on his rifle, but the creature was nowhere to be seen. "Are we clear?" Williams asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "For now," Rick muttered, still scanning the shadows. "But we need to keep moving, we can't stay here." Nelson wiped the sweat from his brow, his hands trembling. "That thing, whatever it was, it's not going to let us leave. I saw it. It wanted us dead." Rick knew he was right. The creature wasn't done with them. He could feel its presence, lurking just out of sight, waiting for the right moment to strike again. He looked down at the strange metal box he had picked up inside the pagoda, now tucked into his backpack. Was it connected to whatever they had encountered? Had they awakened something they shouldn't have? "We're going to make it back," Rick said, trying to steady his voice. "But we stick together, and we don't stop for anything. Whatever that thing is, we can't let it separate us." The squad nodded, though their faces were still pale with fear. They knew this mission was no longer about finding the enemy. Now, it was about survival. As they moved deeper into the forest, the jungle seemed to close in around them, the trees growing thicker and the shadows longer. The air was heavy with moisture, and the oppressive heat had returned, though it did little to warm the icy chill that had settled over the squad. Rick led the way, his senses on high alert. Every crack of a branch or rustle of leaves made him jump. His nerves frayed from the encounter in the pagoda. He could feel the weight of the box in his backpack, as if it were growing heavier with every step. The whispers were louder now, almost as if they were following them. Low, indistinct voices that seemed to come from every direction at once, filling the jungle with a sinister hum. Rick couldn't understand the words, but he could feel their intent. They were being lured deeper into the forest, drawn towards something dark and malevolent. Hours passed, or maybe it was just minutes. Time seemed to lose all meaning in the jungle. The squad marched on in silence, their eyes darting nervously between the trees, waiting for the creature to return. Then, without warning, the jungle opened up into another clearing. This one was different from the first. It was larger, and in the center stood a massive, ancient tree, its gnarled branches stretching high into the sky. The bark was blackened and twisted, as if the tree had been scorched by some long-forgotten fire. At its base were hundreds of small stone carvings, faces, twisted in agony, staring up at them with empty eyes. Rick's stomach turned at the sight. There was something deeply wrong about this place. It felt cursed, as if the very earth beneath their feet was tainted with something evil. "We need to keep moving," Dawson said, his voice shaky, but Rick shook his head. "No, we're not going anywhere until we figure out what's going on here." He approached the tree cautiously, his rifle at the ready. The carvings seemed to watch him, their empty eyes following his every move. As he reached the base of the tree, he noticed something strange. There were symbols carved into the bark, similar to the ones he had seen on the box. His heart skipped a beat. The box. Whatever was happening here, it was connected to the artifact they had found in the pagoda. He reached into his backpack and pulled out the box, holding it up to the light. The symbols on the box and the tree matched perfectly. "What is this thing?" Tom asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Rick shook his head. "I don't know, but I think we need to find out before that thing comes back." Before anyone could respond, the ground beneath them began to tremble. The air grew colder, and the whispers rose to a deafening roar. The stone carvings around the tree seemed to shift, their faces contorting in agony. And then, from the shadows of the tree, the creature emerged once more, its red eyes glowing with malevolent hunger. The air grew deathly still as the creature loomed before the squad. Its grotesque form was barely visible in the flickering light of the dying sun, but its glowing red eyes pierced the darkness. Rick's heart raced in his chest, and he could feel the weight of dread settling over his squad. No one dared move, afraid that even the slightest motion would provoke the monster. "What do we do?" whispered Dawson, his voice barely audible, trembling with fear. Rick didn't answer. His eyes were locked on the creature, his mind scrambling for a plan. Running wasn't an option. The jungle would swallow them whole, and the thing would tear them apart before they could take more than a few steps. The whispers that had haunted them since the pagoda grew louder now, as if the jungle itself was alive, urging the creature forward. The ancient tree behind it seemed to pulse with a dark energy, and the stone faces at its base twisted in silent agony, watching the soldiers with soulless eyes. Rick knew they couldn't fight it, not with bullets, not with anything they had. But the box, the strange artifact he had found earlier, it had to be connected. There was something about the carvings on the box and the tree that felt ancient, as if they held the key to this nightmare. But how? Suddenly, without warning, the creature let out a low growl, its body coiling like a snake preparing to strike. Its red eyes flared, and Rick could feel the overwhelming presence of evil radiating from it. His hands trembled as he gripped the box tighter, hoping it might offer some protection, though he had no idea how. "We have to break whatever curse this is," he muttered to himself, though Dawson overheard. "What are you talking about, Rick?" Dawson hissed, glancing nervously between him and the creature. "What curse? We need to get out of here." Before Rick could respond, the ground beneath them shook violently, and the tree's roots began to writhe like snakes, pushing through the earth. The squad stumbled backward, barely keeping their balance. The creature lunged toward them, but stopped just short of reaching Rick, as if something was holding it back. Rick's heart leapt. It wasn't attacking, it was waiting. "The box?" Rick whispered, realization dawning on him. "It's the box." "What are you talking about?" Tom asked, his voice frantic. Rick raised the strange metal artifact above his head, the symbols on its surface glowing faintly in the dim light. "This thing, it's connected to the tree, to the creature. It's what's keeping it here." The creature snarled, pacing restlessly at the edge of the clearing. As if the box were a barrier it couldn't cross, the jungle around them pulsed with an ominous energy, and the whispers grew louder, more frenzied. "We need to destroy it," Rick said, his voice steady despite the fear coursing through him. Dawson looked at him like he was crazy. "Destroy it? Are you out of your mind? That thing could be the only thing keeping that monster from killing us." Rick shook his head. "No, this thing is what's keeping it alive. It's feeding off the energy of the jungle, off this tree. If we destroy the box, maybe we can stop it." The creature let out a deafening roar, as if sensing their intentions. It lunged again, but the invisible barrier held, keeping it at bay. Rick's heart pounded as he turned the box over in his hands, searching for a way to open it, to end whatever curse had been placed on this cursed land. His fingers traced the symbols, and suddenly, the box began to hum with energy. The glow intensified, and the whispers reached a fever pitch. The jungle itself seemed to tremble, the trees swaying violently in the windless air. "There's no time," Rick shouted. "Cover me." The squad raised their rifles, though they knew it would do little against the supernatural force in front of them. Rick focused on the box, his mind racing as he tried to decipher its mystery. The symbols shifted and twisted under his fingers, as if the box were alive, responding to his touch. Suddenly, with a sharp click, the box sprang open, revealing a small, blackened stone inside. It pulsed with an unnatural light, and Rick could feel the weight of its dark power in his hand. This was the source of the creature's strength, the curse that bound it to this jungle. Without hesitation, Rick raised the stone high above his head and slammed it to the ground with all his strength. The stone shattered with a deafening crack, and for a brief moment, the jungle fell deathly silent. Then, all hell broke loose. The creature let out an ear-piercing scream, its body writhing in agony as it began to disintegrate before their eyes. The ancient tree groaned and split in two, its gnarled branches collapsing to the ground. The air around them seemed to shimmer, and the oppressive weight that had hung over them for so long lifted, as if the jungle itself was finally free from the curse. Rick fell to his knees, panting heavily, the shattered remains of the box lying at his feet. The creature was gone, its twisted form nothing more than a faint memory in the wind. The squad stood in stunned silence, staring at the destruction around them. The whispers were gone, and the jungle had returned to its eerie stillness. The faces on the stones were no longer twisted in agony, they were blank, empty, as if the souls trapped within them had finally been released. "We did it," Dawson whispered, his voice filled with disbelief. Rick nodded, though he didn't feel the triumph he thought he would. The jungle was still dark, still dangerous. But whatever had haunted it for so long was finally gone. "We need to get out of here," Rick said, pushing himself to his feet. "This place, it's not safe." The squad didn't need any more convincing. They gathered their gear and set off into the jungle, their hearts heavy with the weight of what they had seen. As they disappeared into the trees, Rick glanced back one last time at the clearing, at the ancient tree that had stood for so long. It was over, but the jungle would never let him forget. The jungle had gone quiet to quiet. Rick and the rest of the squad stumbled through the dense underbrush, their bodies aching from exhaustion and the terror that had clawed at them for days. Their minds were still reeling from what they had just witnessed, the cursed creature disintegrating before their eyes, the ancient tree collapsing into the earth like a final exhale of the jungle's haunted breath. But even though the creature was gone, the jungle felt wrong. It was as if the darkness that had been holding it captive for so long had left a stain on the land itself, one that would never truly be erased. Rick could see the unease in the eyes of his comrades. Dawson walked with his rifle held tight to his chest, his hands shaking ever so slightly. Tom's face was pale, his eyes darting to every shadow that passed between the trees. They were all on edge, and for good reason. They may have destroyed the creature, but something still lurked in the jungle, something that was watching them, waiting. "We're close," Rick muttered, glancing at the map in his hand. "If we keep heading this way, We'll reach the extraction point by dawn." No one responded. The men were too exhausted, both physically and mentally, to argue. They moved in silence, the only sounds being the crunch of their boots on the jungle floor and the occasional rustle of leaves as something unseen moved in the distance. As they pressed on, the jungle seemed to close in around them, the trees growing denser, the air heavier with moisture. The light from their flashlights barely penetrated the thick foliage, casting long, distorted shadows that twisted and flickered with every step. Rick couldn't shake the feeling that they were being followed. He kept glancing over his shoulder, expecting to see something, a figure, a shadow, a ghost lurking just out of sight. But there was nothing, just the suffocating darkness of the jungle. The squad reached a small clearing, and Rick signaled for them to stop. "We'll rest here for a bit," he said, his voice hoarse, "just for a few minutes." The men dropped to the ground, too tired to care about the damp earth beneath them. Rick sat with his back against a tree, his eyes scanning the jungle for any sign of movement. His heart was pounding in his chest, and he couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. And then he heard it, a faint whisper, carried on the wind. At first, he thought it was just his imagination. But then the whisper came again, louder this time. It was soft, almost soothing, like the wind through the leaves, but there was something off about it. It didn't sound like the jungle, it sounded like a voice. Rick's blood ran cold. He glanced at his squad, but they didn't seem to hear it. Dawson was resting his head on his knees, his eyes closed. Tom was staring blankly at the ground, his face expressionless. No one else seemed to notice. The whisper grew louder, more insistent. Rick strained to make out the words, but they were too faint, too distorted. He stood up, his flashlight beam sweeping over the clearing, but there was nothing, just trees and shadows. And then, out of the corner of his eye, he saw a figure, standing just beyond the tree line. Rick's heart skipped a beat. He pointed his flashlight in the direction of the figure, but there was nothing there. Just more trees. "Did you see that?" Rick whispered, his voice barely audible. Dawson opened his eyes and looked at him, confused. "See what?" "There was someone there," Rick said, his voice shaking. "I saw." He was cut off by a sudden, bone-chilling scream that echoed through the jungle. It wasn't human, it was something else, something far more sinister. The squad jumped to their feet, their rifles raised, scanning the jungle for the source of the scream. But there was nothing, just the thick, impenetrable darkness that seemed to stretch on forever. And then the whisper came again, louder this time. It was no longer soothing. It was angry, a twisted, distorted voice that seemed to come from all around them, echoing off the trees. Rick's hands trembled as he tightened his grip on his rifle. He could feel the panic rising in his chest, threatening to overwhelm him. This wasn't over. The creature they had destroyed wasn't the only thing in this jungle. There was something else, something far more powerful, far more dangerous. "We need to move," Rick said, his voice barely steady. Now, the squad didn't hesitate. They grabbed their gear and began moving, their pace quickening with every step. The jungle seemed to close in around them, the trees twisting and warping in the darkness, their branches reaching out like skeletal hands. The whispers followed them, growing louder and more frenzied with each passing second. Rick's heart was pounding in his chest, his mind racing as he tried to figure out what was happening. Was the jungle itself alive? Was it punishing them for disturbing the cursed ground? He didn't know, and he didn't care. All he knew was that they needed to get out fast. As they moved deeper into the jungle, the air grew colder, and the whispers turned into voices, hundreds of them, all speaking at once, overlapping and intertwining in a nightmarish cacophony. Rick could feel the weight of their presence pressing down on him, suffocating him, and then he saw them, figures, barely visible in the darkness, standing among the trees. Their faces were pale and hollow, their eyes empty and soulless. They watched in silence as the squad passed by, their mouths moving in silent whispers. Rick's breath caught in his throat. He knew who they were. The ghosts of the fallen, the souls of those who had died in this cursed jungle. They were watching him, judging him, waiting for him to join them. The squad broke into a run, the voices growing louder and more desperate, as if the spirits were reaching out, trying to pull them back. Rick's legs burned, his lungs screamed for air, but he didn't stop. He couldn't. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, they burst out of the jungle and into the clearing where the helicopter was waiting. The voices stopped, the whispers faded, and the jungle fell silent once more. Rick collapsed to the ground, his body trembling with exhaustion and fear. The squad gathered around him, their faces pale and drawn, but they were alive. They had made it. As the helicopter lifted off, Rick looked back at the jungle one last time. The ghosts were gone, but he knew they were still there, watching, waiting, and as the helicopter disappeared into the night, Rick knew that he would never forget the horror of that cursed jungle. The jungle had spared him, but it had taken a piece of his soul with it. If you enjoyed today's story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel, Mystical Tales, so you won't miss out on more eerie and thrilling tales in the future. Thanks for watching, and see you next time.